Hello, and welcome to Scott's Odyssey. What would you do as a wet-behind-the-ears 22-year-old with a rank of lieutenant colonel sent out to do some scouting in western Pennsylvania in the 1700s? Well, in this instance, you engage in your first combat. You commit a war crime. You send one of your men to the Great Eternal and have two others get seriously wounded. You commit another war crime against injured captives and set in motion the chain of events that lead to a world war and eventually a colonial rebellion, all in just 15 minutes. Or at least that's what George Washington did. See you in a minute. Welcome back. If you've watched my videos before, thank you for your patronage, and if you're new to Scott's Odyssey, welcome aboard. I know that was a really harsh opening and sounds like a lot of conjecture, but unfortunately, it accurately depicts, in less than 30 seconds, what happened in the Great Meadow on May 28, 1754. And the worst part is, as bad as it sounded, it was far much worse. This will be one in a series of videos dedicated to the French and Indian War, something I've been putting off for a while, which is the North American part of the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France. On February 22nd of 1732, along Pope's Creek on the family plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia, Mary Ball Washington, wife of Augustine, gave birth to George. George was the firstborn of Mary Ball and the oldest of his brothers, Samuel, John Augustine, Charles, and his two sisters, Betty and Mildred. But he was the youngest to his stepbrothers, Butler, Lawrence, Augustine Jr., and his stepsister, Jane, namesake along with her brother Butler to her mother, Jane Butler Washington, who passed in 1729. Yeah, so needless to say, he was the penultimate middle child of a 10-child family. The Washington plantation was not just a plantation, but was pretty much the all that and a bit more plantation in the area. One of the biggest and most definitely the plantation leading all others in the area. So they were well known in all facets of Virginia business and politics. In 1734, the family moved up the Potomac River to the Little Hunting Creek Plantation, or as it's called now, Mount Vernon. In 1738, they relocated once again to Ferry Farm along the Rappahannock River, significantly more close to Fredericksburg. In 1743, Augustine died, which left all the holdings of the plantations to George's 12-year older stepbrothers. And well, as were the times, Mary Ball was not their mother, and her children were only stepbrothers and stepsisters to them, so they didn't feel any need to be the primary supporters of that part of the family. So George and his direct brothers and sisters, along with their mother, had a barely sufficient income from the plantation to keep for themselves. George, being the oldest, dug deep into maintaining the facets of the Rappahannock River plantation. Due to the lack of funds, George did not receive any form of formal education nor the ability to return to England and obtain one. Instead, he may, when he had time, have attended a local school in Fredericksburg, but was more than likely privately tutored. Fortunately, George was born when printed books were becoming much more prevalent and available, along with local pamphlets, newspapers, and even almanacs. This gave George a specific insight into things that grew his knowledge beyond basic reading, writing, and comprehensive math. One thing George allegedly focused on heavily was geometry and trigonometry, which set a foundation for what he would become later in his life. How do we know this? Well, one of the things we still have of George Washington are his actual handwritten copies of many different types of geometrical problems that George himself was so keen on having that he actually kept them and took great care not to have them damaged. Another thing he was keen on keeping preserved were his written copies of 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in the company and conversation of others. And all of this was by age 14. When 1749 came around and George was 17 years of age, he received a commission from the College of William and Mary to be their surveyor of the newly created Culpeper County. By 1750, his surveyor skills made him valuable to the military, so he was brought into military service as an adjutant, or entry-level staff officer to assist a commanding officer of a military unit. When 1752 came, his skills as a surveyor had racked him up over 200 surveys for over 60,000 acres. And although he would no longer continue the direct path of surveying as a job, he would continue to survey locations up until just a couple of weeks before his actual death. In 1753, at age 21, George was sworn into the military as a major of the militia and volunteered for active duty just a few months later. All of this while tensions were reaching a climax between England and France over territories in the America. During 1753, the Ohio River Valley was one of those territorial borders that were creating the largest amount of friction between England and France. When reports came into Virginia Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie that the French were constructing forts in the later part of 1753, which would be Fort Machat and Fort Duquesne, he sent George on his first official mission to deliver a friendly request for the French to withdraw from the valley. The report from George back to Dinwiddie is that the French had no intent on leaving the Ohio, and that in fact they were increasing the number of troops in the region. Dinwiddie commanded the newly formed Virginia Regiment to go into the frontier as a show of force and to establish a fort where the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers converge into the Ohio, called the Forks. George was given the commission of lieutenant colonel and was able to take an advance of the regiment out to the area, scout it, then assist Captain William Trent in establishing the new fort location. When George and his 150 men reached Wills Creek in Maryland, 125 miles from his start and 120 miles short of their destination, he learned that there were over 1,000 French soldiers who had overrun the British who were already working on the fort. With this news and knowing he needed to still get to the site, George ordered his troops to go over the Allegheny Mountains so they could at least establish a defensive position along Redstone Creek and show the French that they were willing to stand and fight alongside their native allies. Over the course of the next month, George and his men cut a road from Wills Creek to the Great Meadows, which is what this particular area near Farmington, Pennsylvania was called at the time. This is where they would wait for reinforcements. Along the way, they stopped at Logstown to ask Lieutenant Harrison to be a guide and to be a spokesman for the Ohio natives. Lieutenant Harrison, a native who was captured by the French as a child, later escaping to and being adopted into the Seneca. He claimed that when he was taken by the French, they had boiled and eaten his father. I know that sounds kind of obscure for information regarding this piece of history, but it'll make sense when we talk about what Lieutenant Harrison did later. A year previous, Lieutenant Harrison had already tried to give back the wampum he received from the French captain Philippe Thomas Chabert de Joncaire, who in turn got Lieutenant Harrison drunk, causing him to forget to hand back the wampum. Lieutenant Harrison continued on to meet with Commander Jacques Lagardeur de Saint-Pierre, my French is really bad, at Fort Le Boeuf, now called Waterford, Pennsylvania. See, Waterford's easier to say than Fort Le Boeuf. Anyway, when he got there, Jacques did not like that Lieutenant Harrison wanted to return the wampum, so, and I quote, evaded taking it and made many fair promises of love and friendship and wanted to live in peace and trade amicably with us and would prove it by sending goods immediately down to the Logstown for his people. This is what led to the initial information and recommendation that the British should build a fort at the Two Rivers Fork, and where the British learned of the increased French troop deployment as well as their building of forts along the river. So, not only did the French make him a captive as a child, boil and eat his dad, but they also took advantage of his honor, which was important, especially now that he was, as the Europeans called him, the half-king of the New World. Lieutenant Harrison was camped at Half King's Rock on May 27th of 1754 with 8 or 9 warriors with him. Just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the Great Meadows where George Washington had all of his men. he sent word to George that less than 15 miles away, 5 miles east of Chestnut Ridge, there were 50 French troops amassed. George sent 40 men to meet up with Tanacharison immediately, and then followed up with a second group of men at sunset who walked a single file line to their destination. Oddly enough, and to give an idea of what it's like in the real central and southwestern Pennsylvania, 7 of those men in that line got lost along the way. It was May 28th, early morning, and the French were found sheltered in a glen that was hidden off of the main trail. George and Tanacharison held a war council and came to a determination that they needed to act, and they needed to act swiftly. Tanacharison took 9 Mingos, or his warriors combined of Seneca and Cayuga, who were now part of the Iroquois, or more correctly, the Haudenosaunee nation, and they circled around the French to come up from behind. From the front came the Virginia militia with George at the lead. And here is where history is written by the winners and things get interesting. According to the French, they had no idea the British were there, and the colonial British immediately fired at them from the tree lines. According to Washington, they saw the French advance toward their weapons once they had been spotted, and so fired upon the French in order to defend themselves. Now, you may think this is no big deal, but you need to realize that at this time the French and the British were not at war with each other. So from the French point of view, George and his men on behalf of Britain just murdered French colonists. George would contest that the French were hiding in the woods near the British, who were unhidden and in an open position within the Great Meadow for days, never acknowledging their presence and acting in a non-diplomatic but rather militaristic capacity. The battle lasted all of 15 minutes, and in the end, 1 British colonist was dead, 2 were seriously injured, 13 French colonists were killed, and 21 were captured. Now, it's important that I point out, when you read this history, it will say Virginians instead of colonists, and for the French it will say soldiers instead of colonists. But I have made it a point to show that in both situations, all the participants, aside from the natives, were just colonists, and on both sides. They could also be considered soldiers, but were not of the official royal militaries, only local militias of their own colonies. During the foray, it's often important to remember ROE. What is ROE? ROE means rules of engagement. It's an agreed upon set of rules for engaging potential enemies or threats in order to lessen the outcome of innocent people being unalived or injured during conflict. Something we here in the United States will not have if anything gets violently bad with the borders of our country, but something we do clearly obey when engaging in foreign wars, typically based upon guidelines set forth in the Geneva Convention. In this situation, it was clear who the commander was, and as is by the rules of engagement, he was not to be harmed in this skirmish because his character would be considered somewhat sacred. Again, according to the rules of engagement, something all of the Virginia militiamen knew, as well as Tanacharison and his Mingos. After the first volley was fired, the French took their turn in a volley, and then when all shots were fired and a ceasefire was attained, George approached Commander Joseph Coulon de Villers-Sierre de Jumonville to discuss the fact that he and his men were hiding as a military in the woods, committing a threat to the British, who were just over in the Glen and not hiding. French officer Michael Pepin de la Force acted as the translator between Jumonville and Washington. But before they had that conversation, Tanacharison came out of the woods behind the French, ran up to Jumonville, and buried his hatchet into his skull, splashing blood and brain matter all over George. Tanacharison held up his axe and stated, "Now I will let you see that the Six Nations can kill as well as the French." La Force actually hid behind Washington, who was allegedly blinking and dumbfounded. So I want to pause here for a moment and put this into a real-life perspective. George takes his men up to the French, who claim they didn't know the British were there, but allegedly reach for their weapons, which in turn causes them to get shot up pretty bad, and they immediately surrender. French officer, Michael Pepin de la Force, acted as an English-speaking liaison to George on behalf of Jumonville. Jumonville attempted to plead his case that they were innocent of transgressions to the British, and George Washington, a 22-year-old in his very first command and conflict during a peaceful, albeit tense time between the French and the British, with claims that George acted poorly and unprofessionally, only to have Tennyson run up and brutally split a man's skull directly in the and onto the face of George and cry out a warrior call for the murder of the French and the power of the natives. I believe it was at this very moment in time that all the beliefs George Washington had and every vow of charity, peace, and goodness he held toward man just left his body for good, especially if you know what things were to come later on in his life. Unfortunately for George, the French commander Jumonville was blatantly murdered. The head of the French proclaimed ambassadorial delegation, making George Washington an instant war criminal in the eyes of the French colonial empire at a time when there wasn't a war yet. But we're not done. After Tennyson made his decree, the Mingo killed and scalped all the wounded in order to send the scalps as proof that the war had officially begun against the French. During the following month, Fort Necessity was established in the Great Meadow, and shortly thereafter, on the morning of July 3rd, 600 French soldiers and 100 Indians, commanded by Captain Louis Coulon-de-Vers, angry brother of dead Commander Jumonville, took up a position in the woods at the edge of the Glen. George had his men withdraw to the entrenchments. The losses were really big on both sides, but much greater on the side of the British, who would not back down. Captain Villars requested a truce in order to discuss the surrender of Washington's command. The British were permitted to withdraw with honors of war, but had to leave their swivel guns behind. A swivel gun was a small cannon that shot grape shot and was usually mounted on the railings of the bow and stern of a ship, but they were allowed to take their own muskets and their own weapons and their own personal belongings. Fort Necessity was surrendered to the French, and George Washington signed that he was guilty for the assassination of French officer Jumonville, although he later denied this, claiming he was told the French word for assassination actually meant responsible for the death of. But either way, it became a sore point for George and the British Crown. George Washington would never again work with any natives in any capacity, and that is the history of the location in southwest Pennsylvania, formerly known as the Great Meadow, but is now just named Jumonville. If you learned something new, give the video a like and share it out to people who might not know the factual story of what happened to start the French and Indian War. If you're here to say, but actually, remember, this is a 10 to 15 minute video telling the history based on the facts collected and not the interpretive concepts of why things happen based on something that you were not there for any more than I was. I just retell the recorded facts, and I'm not here for your dissertation, but rather to provide interesting points in history through those facts. Leave a comment down below how this factual storytelling made you feel, or what you think about the theory that this is where good old George had his actual PTSD moment that changed the future of the colonies forever. Help keep Odyssey alive by jumping out to Patreon or PayPal, or go pick up some merch. These are currently the only ways the channel is supported, and every little bit helps a whole bunch. As always, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.